Okay, great. I was just checking and all of our panelists are here, which is awesome. Thank you everyone for coming back to this session. We're really excited for this panel. So welcome back. Welcome to session 2 on voter suppression, civic engagement, and coalition building. You're going to get right into the session, but first I'd like to introduce our moderator, Munir Meghjani. And he's going to go ahead and introduce all of our panelists. But we're really excited to have Munir. He is very involved in the social justice space in Atlanta and also happens to be a very seasoned moderator and an Emory alum. So thank you so much, Munir, for leading this session. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you both so much and the EPIC team for hosting space for such an important topic as well. I want to start off by acknowledging the Muskogean Creek native land that both my home and Emory University and the Emory Law School sit on. It belongs to a group of people who unfortunately are not spoken about enough and are definitely highly disenfranchised when we talk about voting rights. I also think it's important to note that while we're celebrating the 100th year of voting rights, many Black women, for decades, even after the 19th Amendment passed, were not given that right. And so it's important to kind of note and be aware of the full history that we do live in right now. I am so excited to host and moderate this panel. They are just phenomenal speakers. I had a moment to catch up with all of them before we started, and I'm so excited to learn from them and be educated from them and learn things that I can kind of really take away and go implement in my own life to help fight the voter suppression and fight for our voter rights as well. I know all of you got a quick introduction to the panelists earlier today, but I'm still going to have them do a quick intro and share just in 60 seconds, what they do and why they were drawn to this work that they're doing. So Charles, I will start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Stevens, the founder of the Counter Narrative Project based here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an Atlanta native. I grew up here, and I have always been inspired and understood that I stood on the shoulders of amazing folks, many of which fought and died for my right to vote. Even though my work works at the intersection of racial justice and LGBT rights and the HIV movement, we also understand that combating voter suppression is indispensable to our efforts in all of those various movements, and I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you, Charles. Umair?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Very excited. What's really made me passionate about being in this space and what propelled me into being in this space is two things. First of all, my parents raising me on the ideas of justice and speaking up for those that can't speak for themselves. And that being coupled with the understanding and the acknowledgement of the privileges that I live with and that I'm born with. Being in a middle-class family, receiving the education that I did, receiving the support from the communities around me that I have. And it is my responsibility, I believe, to use the privileges that I've been given to impact, again, those that can't speak for themselves and those in the communities around me. I'm happy to be a part of this group of panelists who I can also learn from. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor. Jonathan?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Emory for hosting and for having me and all of us here today. So I am a voting rights litigator by trade. So I primarily fight voter suppression in the courtroom. And I'm excited to talk to my fellow panelists and to all of you about some of our efforts to fight back against voter suppression tactics all across the country. I work at Campaign Legal Center, which is a Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan organization that works on democracy reform issues nationwide, including in Georgia, where we're litigating a couple cases right now. And I was really drawn to this kind of work and working on voting rights and democracy reform primarily because my parents fled communist Cuba in the 1960s to come to the States. And so from the time that I was very young, hearing their story and how, the country that they came from lost the democratic freedoms that so many of us take for granted, really instilled in me how precious the vote is and how we need to do everything that we can to protect and maintain and expand that right for people who otherwise can't access it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Portia, bring us home.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and be in dialogue with my fellow panelists. My name is Portia Allen Kyle. I work for the Voting Rights Lab. It is a national campaign hub of sorts. We're a policy advocacy organization that, while we're a national organization, we work within states to advance law and policy reforms around voting to really work to make our democracy better. And so I, got into this work, particularly in voting. I'm by trade kind of a civil rights generalist, and have been doing a lot of advocacy in various aspects of civil rights. But it's, the motivation for, how to help Black and Brown communities as best I can, that in this political moment right now led me to dive into voting rights.
Sorry, Munir can't unmute himself. I'm going to unmute him now. Oh, did you figure it out? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yep. Age of Zoom, no worries at all. So, Charles, I want to start with you. When we spoke, you talked a lot about the power of narrative. And today we hear fake news and false statements, so much so that a lot of news organizations said it was almost impossible to fact check our first debate. What is the true power of narrative, and what implication does it have on truth and facts in our community and in our world today?
Here we go. Age of Zoom, lovely. Well, I think that we're in a moment, perhaps more now than ever, with the proliferation of information and messaging that we confront, where we see the power of narratives, and the power of narratives not only to shape policy, but also influence the social worlds that we inhabit. And to that end, I think that we absolutely, those of us that are committed to fighting for justice, those of us that are connected to social justice movements, a lot of our work is absolutely in the policy space, but it's also in the narrative space. In other words, we absolutely must create counter narratives to confront some of the misinformation that gets proliferated, ultimately to scare people, to steal their voices, to rob them of their agency. So we have to fight back on the level of narrative, on the level of symbols, on the level of messaging. And that's really part of the inspiration of my organization, the Counter Narrative Project, to fight back on the level of narrative, to create not only create counter narratives, but to proliferate and explode narratives. And I think historically we see that quite a bit. So what I would say is that, there are many tools that we have in our arsenal, from social media to other kinds of digital organizing, but we must be vigilant in having to confront fake news, or just the proliferation of misinformation, because it's definitely, certainly the consequences are robbing us of our rights, but largely harming the democracy that we live in.
I think that's such an interesting perspective of how that also seeps into voter suppression. And Umair, I'd love to kind of get your opinion on this as someone who's, also grassroots like Charles. What are those tools that you're using to counter this narrative? How do we become more aware of it? And how is it playing into voter suppression now as well?
So I think that the best tool, one of the best tools to be able to create the counter narrative, is first and foremost education, right? Making sure that the communities that don't have access to educating themselves around the processes and the specific methods that are used, which I'll touch on, to suppress their vote. If they don't know what those things are, they can't do anything about them, right? And if you look at not just US history, but just world history, you see that movements are created from the grassroots, right? When countries topple, when governments change, when new opinions rise and like the Voting Rights Act comes into play, that happens because a small group of people had a strong idea and more people added themselves to that, and it created that is how a counter narrative is created, right? However, when you have power centralized, then you have the ability to make people feel that the power that they actually possess isn't real, and it isn't, and it can't be used. So if you see things like the popular vote not being honored, if you see things like gerrymandering happening, or people being able to use their money to promote their politics, then we as people who really actually do hold the power end up feeling like we don't, and thus we don't end up voting.
So that's really interesting that you talk about the decentralization and gerrymandering. Jonathan, one of the many reasons that this election is so important is because of the census that's tied into it, and along with that, the redistricting, or the way that most of us really know it as gerrymandering. What was the original intention of this, and how did it become a tactic that's used now? And what are some of the laws that are around it as well?
Sure. So, from the beginning of the Republic, someone had to draw the legislative lines that each, member of the House of Representatives or your state assembly, each district that they represent. And so the term gerrymandering actually, dates back, almost to the very beginning of this country, named for a member of Congress named, I believe it's Elbridge Gerry, not Jerry. And because his district in Congress looked apparently like a salamander. And so a newspaper in, I think it was Massachusetts, coined the term gerrymandering because the legislature had drawn this district to protect his incumbency. And it looked insane. It looked like a giant lizard. And so historically, we've seen legislatures on, both sides of the partisan aisle draw districts to protect incumbents of both parties. And it wasn't until fairly recently that we saw this kind of major partisan divide on the gerrymandering front. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we started paying more attention to the drawing of legislative boundaries to protect communities of color and make sure that they were able to, elect their candidates of choice as required by the Voting Rights Act. But with the development of computer software that allows for the drawing of districts with very technical precision, alongside an increasingly polarized electorate, where people are more likely now than ever before to vote, down one party line because the parties themselves have become so polarized, we now see huge fights playing out in state legislatures to draw district lines in a way that benefits one party over the other. And really, it's been kind of a one-sided battle because the Republican Party in particular paid a lot of attention to this in 2010 when the Democrats kind of fell asleep at the wheel. And the Republican Party invested a lot of resources in state legislative races because it's state legislatures in most states that draw these maps, both for Congress and for the state legislature itself. And so the Republican Party, because they swept so many state legislative races in 2010, was able to draw maps based on the 2010 census that further solidified their grasp on electoral power, especially in places like Wisconsin and North Carolina that are very evenly divided at the total population level, but where Republicans enjoy huge legislative majorities. And so, this has become a huge matter of public concern recently. And we've actually seen a really, I think, inspiring movement across many states to take that line drawing power out of the hands of the legislature, which is inherently self-interested, and put it in the hands of citizen-led independent redistricting commissions.
So that I had no idea that that's who it was named after. What a legacy to leave behind. um, it's interesting because you talk so much about the state level and kind of, even though I know you're doing litigation kind of all over, there's so much importance in grassroots, right? And even Umair said, all movements are started from grassroots level. So Portia, I went on to Twitter when I was kind of doing some background research on you. And I found a tweet that you have out there that says, it's not enough to get more people at the table. You need to get out of your offices and into the community. Together is the only way we're going to move forward from this. And I know when you were working with President candidate Mayor Buttigieg, you helped create the Douglas Plan, which is a comprehensive strategy to dismantle systematic racism. But the important part for me for that was that it was grounded in lived experiences of Black Americans. And I think so often when organizations are doing work, we're kind of in our table and we're not building new tables with them and we're not going out with them. So how do we think about it from that perspective? Because a lot of it is you don't know what you don't know. So how do people start discovering that?
Yeah, thank you for such a great question. Because so often policy, is often people approach it from the top down, right? Like sometimes it's a lot of lawyers, a lot of legislators, a lot of other people, sometimes with power, sometimes just with proximity to power, who kind of think up things, right? And then begin to, like, wow, wouldn't this be great? And like start to evangelize it all over the place, right? And, you kind of see the disconnect in a lot of things. And especially on the advocacy side, you see it in very particular ways. And one of the ways that you see it is just in the sheer amount of resources that is spent on, things such as education, outreach, et cetera, that is often spent telling communities about the problems that organizations think are important, as opposed to engaging and listening and then coming back once you hear what people actually care about and what actually impacts their lived experiences. And so, so from a policy perspective, in order to move forward, in order for any of this to work, there's kind of a core question to that, like, how do you know what you don't know? And it's like really a reflection. Who asked you? Right? Like before engaging in anything, who asked you to do this? And if the answer is no one, maybe pause, before kind of engaging in a lot of different things. And it is a different way, especially, in the nonprofit advocacy space, it is a different way to operate, especially, when there are strings pulled by philanthropies that, and interested donors and things like that, that sometimes dictate the work, when in reality, we're in a moment where we talk a lot about allyship, and it's like, well, if you were, only supporting something when it when you felt comfortable and, weren't challenged and this and that, you really didn't support it in the first place, right? And like the reality is that a lot of that conversation needs to happen at the nonprofit and, kind of donor level, and really rethink the way in which a lot of advocacy organizations operate and engage.
So I really like your perspective on that of who asked you to do this. And that's something that I've definitely written down. So I appreciate that feedback, and that thought process I think is so important, and something that so many of us have this kind of savior complex, or now we're uncomfortable, so we want to do something. Umair, my next question is for you. And before I get to that, I want to let all of our guests today know that if you've got questions for them, we are going to have a Q&A time. There should be a small Q&A box at the bottom if you want to type in your questions in there right now, and we will get to those in a little bit as well. So Umair, you're the executive director of Georgia Muslim Voter Project. I know you don't just focus on Muslims, but when you all started, there was a big need for Muslims who weren't active, right? They were looking at voter apathy, which is a direct result of voter suppression. And it's unfortunately one of those systems that is working, but it's just working against us. So how do we work on reversing this? How do we get people excited about voting, especially the minority population who may distrust the system or think that even if I do vote, it's not going to make a difference? And even if my person wins, it's not going to really impact me.
That's a phenomenal question. So you'll hear me say this a lot when I'm answering questions. I'm a systems thinker, so I'm always like, okay, like what's the context in which this is all happening, right? And so the context for the Muslim population, a lot of immigrant populations, is you either have people coming from countries where voting, just the act of voting, was a risk to their families and their lives, economically or literally, right? Also, you have people who have been here for so long and have seen so many administrations specifically target their community, in the Muslim community, in the Black community, so on and so forth. So and we're also paying tax dollars to these same administrations. So it's like, what are my tax dollars really doing for me if I'm the one that's being attacked, right? And are looking at, I often say this, the fact that I have a job of registering people to vote, completely nonsensical. Just doesn't make sense that I have this job. It shouldn't be a thing. People should just be registered. So the fact that I have to go out and get people registered is just doesn't make sense. And so you then start seeing that the way that our democracy and the way that our governmental systems are set up is so that the right people vote. It's so that, it's okay if only 50% of the population vote. Those are the people that actually really care about our democracy. And so those are the people that we want to hear from, right? We're very passive in the way that we engage with our coalitions, with our constituents. And where we wait for people to come to, representatives wait for people to come to them and then say, oh, that's what you care about? Okay, let me act on it. Instead of, as a representative, I should go out into the community and pull teeth and beg and plead people to come and vote and let me hear their opinion, instead of me going out and begging for representatives to hear what I have to say. And so our system is completely topsy-turvy. And so you have to start looking at, does our system itself, the way that the rules are created, don't promote active participation, it promotes passive participation. So what are the ways, and there's so many modern democracies. Yes, the United States is the oldest democracy, but that also means we're the least modern democracy in the world. And so there are so many modern democracies that are doing this in a really active participation in such a great way that we need to look at that. For example, instead of town halls where we're waiting for people, our constituents to come and speak to us, having monthly or quarterly surveying of the community, constantly trying to see, okay, we just tried this. Is this working for you? No, it's not. Let's try again. So we need to really look at how we can provide more access points for people to provide their opinion and perspective to the way that the system should work for them.
So I think one thing that I took away from there is that this doubt that the system even works for us, right? And Charles, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about this. There's been so much rhetoric and misinformation about early voting, about mail-in voting. How much of that is true? Will my vote actually count if I send it in through mail? And what do I need to do to make sure that it does?
Absolutely. I think that there are certainly barriers being erected to make it difficult for certain communities to vote. I really do call on some of our national partners and folks in Georgia and folks in Atlanta that are doing great work they're already working hard, but I know they're gonna have to work even harder because there are just so many barriers. But I also feel like there are lessons. This isn't new. There are historical lessons that we can draw upon right here in the state. 2 years ago or so, my group took a field trip to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, sometimes referred to as the Lynching Memorial. And on the panels where you read these stories of racial violence, state by state, county by county, so many of the stories were about people being murdered, people being lynched just for trying to register to vote. And so the environment that we're living in, there are so many lessons that we can take. And I think certainly we need to very much pay attention to the present. I think we need to have the courage to imagine the future, but we also need to look at the past for lessons learned, for blueprints. I think we must be advocates and activists in the archives to understand not only the greatness of the shoulders that we stand upon and their moral strength, but also strategic and tactical lessons, because I think that there's so much that can be offered as we do face and confront these significant barriers that are being erected day after day, minute after minute, to make it difficult for marginalized communities to be a part of the democratic process.
I think I'm going to misquote you here, but I really liked what you said in terms of, you know, work in the present, look at the past, but prepare for the future. I really like kind of that way of thinking. And Portia, I'd love to hear from you. What does the ideal scenario look like, right? If you were in power for a day, what state is closest to achieving like the best system from registration to voting, and how long do you think we need to really achieve that as a nation?
Well, to start with the end of the question first, you know, I think it depends, right? I mean, like we're still moving to a place where not everybody, you know, agrees that everybody should be able to vote, right? And so, you know, while we're still in that space, it'll be really hard to get to the ideal voting system because people are so concerned about making sure other people can't do things they don't deserve to do, as opposed to how can I make it even easier for myself to do things that I, you know, should be able to do, right? And people often, you know, to exclude people act against their own self-interests, especially when it comes to voting and democracy. But, you know, from an ideal world, and it's hard to say which state because, you know, the diversity of our country is the reason why there's no one good voting system, and that what works for, you know, some populations in some places, what, you know, works, for example, in, you know, a city with great mail service and, you know, a lot of amenities and public transportation and, you know, things of that nature, a voting system there will necessarily look different than it does in very rural areas. It'll look different than it does on tribal lands. It'll look different than it does in, you know, kind of suburban communities that are just set up a little bit differently. And we need that flexibility in the voting systems. And all of them can be ideal so long as like each scenario can be like our ideal voting system tailored to that particular population. And I think that's where we miss out now. You know, I'd also probably take away the citizenship requirement. If you live here, you should be able to vote. But, you know, well, hopefully we will get there one day, one step at a time.
Hopefully one day indeed. Jonathan, I know you've had a lot of experience in litigation from counties to federal government. Has there been a case that's been the most memorable or the most impactful for you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have had, I have lost count of how many cases we have filed and litigated just this year, you know, lifting various barriers, especially to mail and early voting because of COVID. And, you know, I do want to circle back quickly before I answer that question to what Umera and Charles were talking about. And I don't want to downplay the like very real barriers that exist, especially for communities of color, for tribal communities, for rural communities. But because there's been so much misinformation, especially during the most recent presidential debate about the security and the integrity of our election systems and mail voting in general, I do want to, you know, maybe assuage some of those concerns and say that our election system has its flaws and there are barriers for people, but more often than not, your vote will be counted. And the system does work if you can navigate it, and that's where the tricky part is. So for folks who are planning on voting by mail, you know, just make sure you're reading the instructions on your mail ballot closely. There's a lot of ways that mail ballots can be rejected for silly technical mistakes, signatures, things like that. So make sure that you are paying attention to all the little details, using the right color ink, signing the same way every time. and keeping track of deadlines and just voting as early as possible, whether you're doing it by mail or in person. And then as far as one particular case that's been, really impactful for me, it actually ties back to something Portia said earlier about, we're still arguing in this country about who can and who deserves to vote, even beyond, whether or not non-citizens should be able to vote. We still can't agree on whether all citizens should be allowed to vote. So for the last, year and a half, I've been involved with the big felony rights restoration case out of Florida, representing people in Florida of, all political persuasions, right, left, center, who have passed felony convictions, who have completed the carceral terms of their sentences, and just want to, get their voice back and have a chance to shape the democracy that they live in. I grew up in Florida, so it's personal for me to see, after in 2018, the people of Florida voted overwhelmingly to restore the voting rights of their neighbors, to have Florida's state government turn around and slap all of these financial requirements on it and create a system that's impossible to navigate, just to deny, their fellow Floridians the right to vote because of their criminal histories, is, appalling. It goes against every principle that our democracy, is supposed to stand for, and the will of Florida's voters as expressed less than 2 years ago. So that's been a really fulfilling case to be able to work on, to be able to talk to these folks who are, grandparents and members of their communities. They are, in every way but one, which is that they cannot walk into their polling place and cast their ballot, no matter how hard they try, because they simply can't afford it. And it's absurd to be putting a price tag on democracy in the year 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. It's essentially making people pay to have the right to vote. Charles, I'm sure you've come across a lot of voter suppression tactics. What are some that particularly impact the Black and LGBTQ community? What of those cross apply, you think, to other minorities? And how do we name these barriers and create awareness around it as well?
Yes, well, two things. One is, one of the biggest barriers to voting that's been created is narratives around distrusting the voting system, which Jonathan just kind of spoke to, and making people think that essentially their vote won't count or they can't vote, and just on that level, like really not only dealing with the just getting from your house to the voting, the polling place, but also just really trying to take away your resilience and your desire to vote because you believe that either your vote won't count or won't matter, or that the system is flawed, or that there's something, and just really trying to basically take your belief in the system away. And I think that a lot of our work really is to counter that and to not make people basically afraid to vote. I think we've also seen narratives around possible voter intimidation, and folks feeling like if they go vote, they might be harassed, or there may be, and so those kinds of things. So I just really think on the level of narrative, we absolutely have to create, well, one, recognize that there really are barriers to voting that exist. We can't act like there aren't, but at the same time and simultaneously still empowering folks to go vote, and at the same time willing to fight those barriers as they arise. I think that's really important. And I really think that that's something that crosses all marginalized communities, especially communities that already have a shaky faith in democratic institutions, because we have been failed. And I say this as a Black gay man, being failed by so many democratic institutions, from healthcare to schools to the criminal justice system. And I think that we also have to have a very honest conversation about just the failure of these institutions and why voting is an important step in addressing some of those failures of the institutions. And I say this also as, this is LGBT History Month, right? So just recognizing that these are just very real things that are part of the system that we live in.
So Omer, I can only imagine working on some of these things that Charles and so many of our panelists are working on takes a village, right? And it takes a lot of coalition building, which is kind of this term that we've been hearing of a lot. What does that actually mean, and what tools and strategies do you use to build coalition and to bring people together? And what are some pitfalls that people may not be thinking of when they're doing this?
So I think, again, what you have to, as you're entering into a space, right, what you have to do is you have to consider, the context in which you are entering. More likely than not, there are already people organizing around what it is that you're trying to impact and trying to contribute to. And so what we have to make sure that we do is we understand, okay, who are the holders of influence and who are the holders of knowledge in the space that I'm trying to come into. So when I came in as the executive director for Georgia Muslim Voter Project, my immediate response wasn't like, okay, I got all the ideas, I'm gonna say you got to do this, then you got to do this. Like, no. The first thing that I did is I came in and met every single one of our partners and our for example, Pro Georgia and Asian Americans Advancing Justice and CPACs and so on and so forth, talking to each one of them to understand, okay, what are you working on now, and how can I help? How can I as an individual and then as an organization come in and support what you're doing instead of trying to recreate the wheel, right? And then also taking a look at what are the true needs of
Here's what I found on the web.
Sorry about that. Sorry, what was that? Yes. So also understanding what are the true needs of your community, because what I need as a Muslim American male is going to be very different than what another member of my community is going to need. So really trying to understand what the nuances of those needs are and how they fit in. The pitfall is kind of what I talked about at the beginning. We live in a culture that really values quote unquote great men, right? Where you see these trailblazers coming in and changing the scope of the land, and if these saviors were the reasons that these saviors were the reasons why the change occurred, or any real impact was able to be made, and taking yourself out of that context and understanding that, no, I'm not just one person that's going to come in and create this grand level of change, but realizing that you need partners, and you need people that think differently than you and come from a different perspective, so that your idea is much stronger, more holistic, and can impact to a much greater degree.
So I speaking of the greater degree, Portia, if an alien was to come down to Earth today, I think they would be troubled by many things, but one of the things would be in this realm of voting, right? I think anyone who looks at it now would say the one way to be democratic and to practice democracy is to vote, and to vote during a presidential year. What are some other ways that we can embody democracy throughout our lives and throughout the years and months when there isn't a presidential election? And what are some of those things that are the most impactful that you would say?
Yeah, that's a interesting question, because I would probably take a different perspective, in that we overemphasize voting as the way to participate in democracy at the expense of everything else. And so, you don't just participate in democracy by, kind of showing up at the polls. And as many people have acknowledged, there are a number of different reasons, why one may never make it to the polls for that to even occur. And so, if that is the only aspect we're emphasizing, we are losing a lot of talent who can be informing our democratic processes. We're losing a lot of opportunities to engage and to reach out to communities. And so part of identifying that is recognizing that voting doesn't occur. I guess to say it differently, I was probably going to say it in the negative. To phrase it in the affirmative, people aren't just voters. They have whole identities, and they just happen to vote, right? And so thinking about people in terms of their whole identities can also then help think about ways to engage people in the entirety of our, kind of government and democratic process. And so, for example, if you're acknowledging some of the barriers to voting, some of those solutions will have nothing to do with voting systems, right? And I think, a good example, Jonathan mentioned, Amendment 4 down in Florida, and that it's not just a voting question. It's fundamentally, how does our criminal justice system function at the intersections of, voting and really the essence of citizenship. And so when you're looking for solutions to a lot of these questions, you will often need to look outside of a strict voting lens, outside of the show up, when the election season is happening. We don't like when the parties do it, right? when candidates only come to communities every 4 years, and vice versa, we should be showing up, whether it's fighting for transparency, thinking about, kind of the intersections of, various experiences of labor, the labor market, employment, criminal justice system, just so much informs our identities. And all of that also then needs to inform democracy in the ways in which we practice it.
So speaking of the ways that we practice our democracy, I think something that's been on a lot of our minds for the past few months, but also very recently in the past, 48 hours. And Jonathan, I'd love your opinion on this. If the president's, ability to perform as a president is in question, if he isn't able to do it, talk us through a little bit of the 25th Amendment of what's the process if he does recover, if he recovers but doesn't feel well, or delicately and things that people are thinking about, if he doesn't recover from this at all, what does that process look like?
Sure. I smile because obviously we didn't cover this the last time that we spoke because it wasn't an issue, but I had a feeling this was coming given the events of the last, I guess, 48 hours, even though it seems like a whole month has gone by since, Thursday. So I'll start with the good news and the clear answers first, which is in terms of just continuity of government, that is very clear. If the president is unable to discharge his duties in office for any reason, if he's incapacitated or God forbid dies, as has happened in the past, the Constitution provides the vice president assumes the presidency and we continue onward. There is a further chain of succession in the event of something catastrophic that's been set forth by Congress. After the vice president, the Speaker of the House, the Senate, the president of the pro tem of the Senate, and then several members of the cabinet. So that is, taken care of. We will have government in the event of something catastrophic happening to the presidency. As far as how it affects the election, as with many questions in 2020, there are no clear answers because this really is uncharted territory. Normally, if a candidate were to, drop out or for whatever reason be unable to continue after being nominated for the presidency, the parties, the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee, have a lot of power to, they have their own internal procedures to basically vote internally and choose a new nominee. That gets tricky when we're this close, 30 days out from election day, and ballots are already, printed almost everywhere, in many states having already been sent out. And in fact, around 3 million votes have already been cast. So just from a logistical standpoint, it would be nearly impossible to reprint the ballots with different names on them at this point. And there are a lot of open questions about what the process would look like, whether, it's one of the quirks of the presidential election system in the US is that we don't actually vote directly for the candidates. We vote for a slate of electors who then submit their votes for that candidate to Congress. In many states, electors are bound by law to cast their electoral votes for the winner of the popular vote in their state. But what happens if that person is deceased or otherwise unable to carry out their role as president? It really is uncharted territory. In all likelihood, I would imagine if the worst were to come to pass between now and when electoral votes are submitted to Congress and counted. My sort of default assumption is that the electors, would still cast their ballots either for President Trump or maybe instead for Vice President Pence if they were bound to do so. And then, there's a lot of technical ways that Congress deals with the electoral votes. They would, I think, most likely probably substitute the Vice President in. If it happens after electoral votes are counted, then I think we're in firmer ground where, the president-elect is unable to discharge their duties, the vice president-elect assumes the office. So if we get to mid-December and it's pre-inauguration, there are mechanisms in place for that. But I guess the real answer is we don't know. We've never had to deal with something like this before. And so it's there's a lot of smarter people than me are digging through the Constitution and the Electoral Counts Act to figure that out as we speak. So hopefully it doesn't come to that.
Hopefully. I learned yesterday that in political speak, this is called the October surprise, because it's just so many things that happen in October are kind of waited for October to impact November elections. So definitely interested in seeing how this happens. If people are more interested in it, the New York Times Daily did a wonderful episode about it yesterday as well, and kind of did some deep diving, but I think Jonathan kind of covered that 30-minute segment in 2 minutes very well. We are going to shift over to the Q&A at this time. So if you've got questions, please drop them into the Q&A. Should be a little chat box for you to drop them into. If you can't find that chat box, feel free to type it into the chat itself, and we'll take as many questions as we can and get them answered as we move forward here. So the first question that I have is targeted towards Portia, but if there's someone else who wants to chime in after she's done, please do so as well. So the question is, Portia illustrated the importance of avoiding the savior complex and instead engaging communities directly to understand their perspectives. How do we balance this approach when mainstream narratives can lead to people seemingly thinking and acting against their own self-interest?
Yeah, that's it's a tough question, and a question that really goes to the core of kind of who we are as advocates and what our role is within these organizations in relation to communities. And so it's something kind of I apply in all of my work, but really something I had to learn in the criminal justice space. And that is people who are when people say people closest to the problem or closest to solution, you kind of need to believe that. And so, even when I'll use an example, I'm a firm believer in abolition, many who are impacted by the criminal justice system are not abolitionists. That's okay, right? And so when thinking about what then is needed and what advocacy must occur, it's often taking the lead of people who have, kind of been there through lived experience. And, sometimes it's, we don't all necessarily kind of need to agree, and it's not necessarily a question of acting against your morals, but, are you really acting on behalf of people if people are telling you what you want and you are instead trying to convince them they actually want something else? Or inserting, the kind of belief that the core of the saviorism complex is this fundamental belief that, we as these orgs, mostly white led, this is, a panel of people of color in this space. That is it. Just in my experience, we are not the majority of people who are doing this work on this at all. So this is kind of very unique, but fundamentally goes to the core that there's this belief that, the organizations and the people that run them know better than people, in community, people that actually, live and are impacted by a lot of the policies that we're working and impacting. And you have to fight that to the core, just reject it as wholly untrue. And when people tell you what they want, believe them and then fight for them, right? And that is when you are doing the work.
I love that. Believe them and fight for them. I think that's such an important takeaway message for so many of us who are in this work. And, to circle back to what we said earlier, is who asked you to do this work, right? And I think that kind of makes it a full circle for sure. So thank you so much for your feedback on that. I do want to be sensitive of time and make sure that we end this session on time to allow for time for the next session, which I'm really excited about as well. So I'm going to ask our panelists for some closing thoughts. And I know 2020 has been a year of heaviness and self-thought, and it's been a dark year for a lot of people, but I also think that it's been a year of rejuvenation. And while I don't think any of us are going to walk out of 2020 looking any younger, I do kind of look at it as the year of the Phoenix, where we're going to hit a restart button and so many important things are coming out of this year. So I'm asking our panelists, in a closing thought, share something positive that has happened in your field of work, and one takeaway that if you could tell everybody here today, here's something that you can do right now in the next 30 days to fight voter suppression or to increase voter turnout or to do something that's important for our democracy, what would that be? So something positive that's happened and something that we can all take away to put into action after this panel. So Charles, I'll start with you once again.
Yes, I think one positive thing in my work has been the opportunities for coalition building in a lot of movement spaces. To be honest, folks don't always play really nicely together, but I've had really great experiences partnering, collaborating with everyone from the New Georgia Project to the ACLU of Georgia, Pro Georgia. Like I've just had a lot of really great, our organization has just had a lot of great experiences being at tables. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but in terms of like not great, but my experience has just been really positive. And there's just been like this incredible will to work together, to collaborate, to figure stuff out, to strategize, and to really work to combat voter suppression. So I think that's been really one really positive thing. In terms of something that people can do, I think the most tangible thing that you can do is have conversations. I was thinking about what Portia was saying about how sometimes folks don't operate in their best interests. And I mean, I think part of that is that there's a conversation that we have to have with policymakers. And I think there's a conversation we have to have with regular everyday folks. And I think the messaging is a little different. And I think, and it's no matter how great our analysis is and how intersectional our lens is and the stats and the ways that we can speak policy wonk. But if we're not able to talk to everyday folks and make our message relevant to their lives, I think we do them a disservice and we do ourselves a disservice. So I would say have the conversations and really keep the conversations going.
I think dialogue is definitely key to our combined success. Umair?
Something positive. I think it's something recent that is starting to happen within our organization that we're seeing a little bit in the community. First, I think on the theme of being engaged and participating is more than just voting. What we've seen recently, we helped a bunch of high school students in Gwinnett County to go to their board of election and speak out against a reprimand that was done to a teacher for having a Black Lives Matter poster behind her during her class. And we had 11 to 13 students come to a board of education meeting and keep continuously and consistently speaking out against it. And now we see those same board members coming to our students saying, you're clearly onto something, talk to us, see what we can do, tell us how we can do better. And so now they're starting the Gwinnett Students for Equity group. And these are 16, 17-year-olds who literally don't have the right to vote and have been told by society that, hey, you're too young to count yet and too young to matter, your opinions to matter. And they're the ones that stepped up, so we can learn a lot. And so I think that has been a really great positive light to that's where we should be going. In terms of what people can take away from this and what they can do actionable, first, on the non-action side, if what we've been talking a lot about has been what are the narratives right now. So if the narratives right now are that your vote doesn't matter, whether you participate or not, it doesn't matter, like things will happen without you and things are stacked up against you. If that's what the narrative is, and that's what people in power are trying to push, then what the fact is and what's truly what is true is that you have power. So begin believing that you have power to make a difference in your community, and not just in your community, but in this country. And so if you're registered to vote, I applaud you and I congratulate you, but your work isn't done. Go make sure all of your friends are registered and your family members are registered to vote. If you've participated in the census, again, I applaud you for already doing so. But we got a few more days. Don't know how many more days. We've got at least a few more days to complete the census. So make sure everybody else completes their census. Get your absentee filled out. If you need to register to vote, I'll do a shameless plug of go to gambp.org/register, and you can register to vote. And if you do /census, you can figure out how to fill out your census. Please make sure you do that.
I'm going to age myself here, but you took me back to my Captain Planet days where it was, you know, all the rings came together and together you have the power. The power is yours. I like it. Jonathan?
Sure. So one thing that I think sort of keeps me going in all of this work, especially lately, is just recognizing that there is a real, like, tangible energy among the American people that is focused on issues of democracy reform and voting rights. And there's a real, I almost don't want to say it because I don't want to jinx it. There's like a real movement in this country among the people towards expanding the right to vote, the likes of which I don't think we've seen for a very long time. And, you know, that manifested itself at the ballot box in 2018, not just with the passage of Amendment 4 in Florida, which I'll note, Amendment 4, yes, got more votes than any statewide candidate in Florida. So that means it was bipartisan. 65, 66% of people approved it. In Michigan, we saw citizen-led ballot initiatives to expand access to mail voting, to expand early voting, to take line drawing out of the hands of politicians and put them in the hands of the people, to, you know, eliminate gerrymandering. We saw the same thing in Utah. People are waking up to the fact that, you know, democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to roll up your sleeves and, you know, get into it. Like Portia said, it's not enough to just show up on November 3rd, cast your vote and say, great, I did democracy. You know, like Omer said, register your neighbors to vote, be a poll worker. There is a chronic poll worker shortage in almost every jurisdiction in this country, every election cycle, and it is not too late to sign up. And, you know, mistakes at the polling place, people not knowing what to do and telling people, oh, you have the wrong ID, you can't vote provisionally. That's disenfranchisement. That's a real form of voter suppression. And so if we have, you know, people who are committed to democracy and to expanding the right to vote, working the polls and with a mindset of helping people and making sure that they can vote instead of trying to find ways to stop them, that makes a huge difference. And so, I mean, I am really heartened by the focus, especially among young people, on issues of democratic reform, whether it's voting or redistricting or campaign finance or any of these issues.
I love that. I think the tangible energy is definitely something that a lot of us are feeling, and in ways that we've never felt it in years or decades in the past. I love that you were able to give that such a cool name. Portia, bring us home.
Yeah, I've been, you know, thinking and listening as everyone kind of named everything I was thinking about, but, you know, before I got here. But, you know, I think the one thing I'll say is, you know, probably a little more reflective, but very hopeful, and that this mass awakening on race kind of posts or in the wake of George Floyd has presented an opportunity. And it's presented an opportunity to really think about policy differently and how we engage in it. And so, you know, there are many Black and brown people in these spaces that have been shouting, you know, into a void sometimes for years that, like, no, if you're not, you know, if you're not deconstructing the system, you are propping it up. Like, you can't play both sides. But, you know, now that we have, like, Dr. Kendi's book, and, you know, people, well, if you're not actively anti-racist, then, like, right, like, you know, there's kind of no in between. And so, like, now that people have, like, the buzz phrase and, like, you know, things like that, I think it has led at least to like the beginnings of reflection, and internally for organizations, real conversation about how exactly to do this work and what to do. And it like ends up being a real, and I think it's a real exciting opportunity for a number of different reasons, like both in this climate, but also in terms of thinking like what that long-term vision is and how do we get there, and what does it look like, and not to be constrained by the smallness of other people's imaginations just because they are closer and more proximate to power. And I think this moment gives us that opportunity to really go the distance.
Absolutely, and that's why I think 2020 is such an important year, right? It's such a transformational year for so many of us to be able to achieve the things that we've been trying to do for so long. So I want to once again thank all of our wonderful panelists. I know I'm walking away with a lot of notes and a lot of thoughts. I also want to thank Epic for putting this together. And I hope that all of you really leave with a message of, your power is your voice and your voice is your vote. And we have the power to change the rhetoric in our communities, in our states, and in our nations, and as a result in the world. And I hope that we all take that very seriously. Role models like John Lewis and C.T. Vivian literally were willing to get beat up and sacrifice their life for the right to vote. And we have it, and I know it's difficult, and I know there are roadblocks, but compared to what they went through, I know that together we can go through this. C.T. Vivian said, "It is in our actions that we find out who we are." And I think all of you being here speaks a lot about your actions and what you find important, what you want to do in the world. And I hope that this session and this panel has really fired you up and put that wind beneath your wings, because I know it's hard work and I know the work that you're doing is very important. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. Thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you so much to the Epic team for allowing this space to create this dialogue. I know I'm really excited about the next group of speakers as well, so I'll hand it back over to our host and our moderators to take us away.
Thank you so much, Portia, Charles, Jonathan, Umair, and Munir. That was a fantastic discussion. I've been looking forward to it for like 4 months since I've been speaking to all of you, and it did not disappoint. Thank you so much. So yes, we have another session coming up, our last session on electoral reform. I'm going to put, Claire put the Zoom link in the chat. I'm going to ask you all to join a bit early because we are running a bit early. So here it is. So it's 12:22 now. We're going to try to get started at 12:25. So if you can just join at 12:20, sorry, not this one, this one. If you could just join at 12:25, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.